Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Andrea Ostheimer, representative of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung to the United Nations here in New York. It is my pleasure to welcome you today to one of our side events in the context of this year's UN Convention on the Status of Women, the signature event on the realization of women's rights. For both our Spanish and German-speaking audiences, we are providing simultaneous interpretation today, and you will find the respective channels at the bottom of the Zoom menu bar. In our discussion today, we want to address the question why women still remain underrepresented in politics, and particularly in political parties. It is certainly not the case because women would be less interested in political or social affairs. To the contrary, the high number of women engaged in civil society shows that we want to make a difference and we want to develop our societies. However, these interests are neither reflected in the number of women active in political parties, which still remain the most important fora for political activism in a representative democracy, nor do we see more numbers of women in top political leadership positions. To the contrary, in some instances, the numbers are decreasing, and they even might further decrease in the light of the pandemic and additional obligations by women. Our panelists today all have managed to rise to the top in their respective parties. We not only want to hear from them their personal experiences, but also want to discuss with them what kind of conditions and frameworks need to be created in order to bring more women, and particularly young women, into politics and into political parties. And I have the honor to introduce to you Eva Abdullah, the Deputy Speaker of Parliament of the Republic of the Maldives. Honorable Abdullah already serves her third term in Parliament and had been the first woman elected to a governing council of a political party in the Maldives. It is great to be able to learn from your experiences today, and thank you so much for sharing your time with us. For us as Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, it is a particular pleasure to introduce to you also Silvia Prea, member of the German Bundestag since 2017 and Vice President of the Christian Democratic Union since 2019. Honorable Prea, you started your political career on local level but managed to move quickly into the German Parliament. It is a pleasure to have you today with us, and we are really looking forward to hear your recommendations for women who strive into politics. When we discuss the standing of women in political parties, it is also important not only to discuss among women politicians. Although I would add that we still need to do much more to build up our own support networks and strategic alliances, just as male politicians are doing. But it is equally important to find conducive environments. Political parties have to find ways and means to encourage women to become active, and they also have to reward their engagement accordingly. So it is for me a pleasure to welcome Hector Larios, former and longtime senator for PAN in Mexico, and since 2018 also Secretary General of PAN. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias. Last but not least, I would like to welcome Fusia Saleh, who is representing the People's Justice Party in Parliament in Malaysia since 2008. Honorable Saleh has also served as Deputy Minister for Religious Affairs in the Prime Minister's office. Thank you so much for sharing your evening with us, Honorable. We are delighted to learn more also about the political careers for women in societies where culture might constitute an additional obstacle. Our moderator today will be Saskia Brechenmacher, who is currently a fellow at the Democracy, Conflict and Governance Program of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Saskia Brechenmacher has just recently published a piece with the indicative title, "Political Parties Were Not Made for Women. This Has to Change." And certainly she will lead us through a thought-provoking discussion today. But before I'm handing over to Saskia, let me announce some housekeeping rules. We want to keep this session short and sweet, and we will finish after 60 minutes. Thus, we will start off with a round of questions addressed by our moderator to the panelists. If you, our audience, want to address questions to the panel, please write your questions into the chat box so we can include them into the discussion as soon as possible. Interpretation channels for German and Spanish you can find on the bottom of the Zoom bar, and this event will also be recorded and uploaded on our YouTube channel afterwards. So you can share it or you can also revisit it. And with these technical remarks, I'm handing over now to Saskia Brechenmacher for our panel discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Andrea, for this very kind introduction and also for convening this discussion here today. As was just mentioned, my name is Saskia Brechenmacher. I'm a fellow at the Carnegie Endowment, and I'm absolutely delighted to be facilitating a conversation here today about gender equality in political parties with such a diverse group of political leaders from really different corners of the world, which I'm sure will make for an interesting discussion. So as you all know, the theme of this year's session of the CSW is women's participation and leadership in decision-making. And in discussions about and research about the causes of continuing gender disparities in politics, we often hear the standard complaint about political parties, right? That they are the problem, not the solution, that they're often male-dominated institutions, they're gatekeepers, and that they are sometimes resistant to change. But then at the same time, there's this different narrative about political parties, namely that they're still very much needed, right? They are the channels through which we organize, through which we engage in electoral politics, through which policy change happens. So with this conversation here today, I'm interested in moving a little bit beyond just the standard complaint about political parties and to help shift the lens a little bit and learn from all of you about how can and do political parties change, what strategies are working, and what else needs to be done. So to kick off the conversation, I'd maybe like to first turn to you, Mrs. Breher. You're both an elected MP and a deputy leader of the German CDU. And I was curious, so one of the challenges we are seeing in many Western democracies, but also in other parts of the world, is that young women are politically active, right? And they're politically organized, but they're not necessarily always interested in joining a political party. Now, as someone who's built a successful career within a political party framework, I'm curious to hear your thoughts about this phenomenon. What do you think explains this? Would you mind just unmuting yourself for the audience?
Yes, is okay.
Now, is it okay? Thank you very much for the question. How I made it, I don't know actually, but I'm very happy to be able to take part in this panel discussion. And thank you very much to Mrs. Ostheimer and her team that you have created such a platform and organized this platform for us to discuss. I'm probably not representative for many of my colleagues, male or female, within our party. I have done voluntary service, and at home in my region, I was networking a lot before I entered into the German parliament. Through my voluntary and my professional life before, many people knew me, and thus I was able to prevail against men when I ran years ago. But I think at the same time, parties themselves have to have interest in getting more women, and parties have to develop further, people develop further, and mixed teams are simply better. And in the future, if parties want to be attractive for their electors, they have to have diverse teams. And that includes more women. That's why, first and foremost, it is the task of the party and the men in the party to ask, what do women need? How is the debating culture? What times do you discuss? And they have to ask themselves, where are the women? Where can I find the women? They have to be addressed actively. They have to be motivated. They have to be convinced. Let's not wait until they come and say, please, can I join? I think that is very important, that men in the parties are very active.
Thank you. I think that's a very helpful perspective shift from the women themselves to what the parties need to be doing. Would you be able to expand maybe on a specific measure that you've seen in your own party or other parties take that have helped attract more women into political parties?
I believe it's difficult to say whether that is true for all parties. But in our party, I believe the men have to help firstly. And we have a quota, or we want to introduce a quota for our party, the CDU. And it is important to convince the men to represent that. Where there are no women, many women don't feel well. It is important to find individual women, to promote them and to make them visible, to bring them into the foreground, not just to have them as a member of a session, but also to be visible. And in the CDU, also, it's not important just to have the chancellor, but it is also important to have women in different leadership positions. That's the only way this can succeed, I believe.
Visibility of female politicians to sort of change the face of leadership in the party and make it more accessible to others to follow in their footsteps. I would like now to turn to you, Ms. Abdullah. You have served as a parliamentarian now for 3 terms already and also have a leadership role in the parliament. Based on your experience, could you talk a little bit about what you view as the main obstacles that can make it difficult for women to rise into these types of leadership positions in your political context?
Does this sound okay?
Yes, now we can hear you.
All right. Thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me to speak. I was asked to speak on if there are specific measures in the Maldives to help women come to leadership positions and specific measures in political parties. And also on what we can do, what has been successful. Firstly, there are no special measures at all in any of the political parties. Let me tell you a little bit about women in political parties in the Maldives. As some of you might know, Maldives was a dictatorship up until 2008. And for that, we had our first political party in 2005. The Maldivian Democratic Party, the first political party in the country, the biggest party. We have a very strong women's wing in the party. Throughout the entire struggle to bring down a dictator and to bring about democracy, that women's wing, the leadership of the women's wing and all the membership, the activists of the women activists of the women's wing, they were very much at the forefront of bringing about an end to the dictatorship, very much at the forefront of the reform movement. Any of you who might have struggled in such a reform movement would know that women make up a huge chunk of political activism, of democracy activism, of human rights activism. So we were able to bring an end to the dictatorship and bring about democratic government in 2008. And then again, 3 years later, we were toppled in a coup. Again, after the coup, it was women who came out on the streets. It was women of my party who put themselves in harm's way, who got themselves beaten up, who got themselves thrown in jail, who sacrificed much of their personal lives and who faced violence at the hands of authorities day in, day out, even after the coup. And again, we managed to bring about a democratic, free and fair election. And again, we're in power. But I think this is the bit that's very familiar to all women political activists. Once the hard work was done, once the fighting on the streets was done, we looked back and everybody who was elected to leadership positions were men. None of the women who were at the forefront of the reform movement made it to leadership positions. When I say none of the women, of course, I am one of 4 women who made it to the parliament. And that really doesn't count. That is such an abysmal number that it really counts almost as 0, as far as I see it. Not 0, but very nearly. And that has taught us a couple of lessons. Firstly, that without active encouragement, women are not going to make it to leadership positions. But something that struck me, Saskia, what you just said, the difference that women leaders can make. Having even very few women in leadership positions has shown the kind of difference we can make in policy and especially in legislation. We came into government, even if it's just 4 of us, we're a presidential system, so parliamentarians are not in the cabinet, but we have a couple of women who made it to the cabinet, who are appointed by the president. With their help and with us in parliament, we've been able to bring about legislative changes to the local councils, which means we have put 30% quota for local council for women, which means that our party now has nearly 1,000 female candidates running for the local council elections, which take place in a couple of weeks' time. This is something that we would have never seen without legislation. My experience is that through many years, even from the time I was a teenager, my young adult life, for many years of speaking on this issue, quietly, privately, publicly, very loudly, screaming with megaphones on the streets. Through many years of speaking on this issue, I found that unless we put this into actual policy and actual legislation, it's just not going to happen. Just by us advocating for it, it just hasn't happened. Women in leadership positions hasn't materialized. As Sylvia also pointed out, unless we can implement these changes in the party, in the parliament, it doesn't happen. And for me, my experience is that without putting into legislation and without allocating the necessary budget to implement that legislation, it just doesn't happen. So we've started with local councils. Hopefully, this is an opportunity for those women who get elected to the local councils to show that their communities, that women can make a huge difference, that women can lead, that women can run their communities. Hopefully, the next step is nationally implement this for political parties and hopefully for the parliament. I know there's a lot of backlash on the quota system, and I know that none of us are very clear if it actually works long-term or not. I know there's a huge debate out there, but without implementing quotas, we're just not seeing women come into positions. As Andrea pointed out, when we first started in the Maldives, it's actually slipping backwards. The combination of religious extremism and the violence that women in this country who are politically active have faced and the harassment we've faced at the hands of authorities for many years, with these elements combined has meant that women are far more reluctant or less reluctant to put themselves out there. So my suggestion is, my experience is without legislation and the budgeting for it, it's not going to work. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That is a really helpful overview, and both the emphasis on the actual legislative reforms, putting things on paper, but then also acknowledging the risk of resistance and backlash, and how do we think preemptively about that in order to make it easier for women to step forward. Ms. Sally, maybe turning to you now, I was curious to hear a little bit your thoughts on this discussion, particularly also in the context of the ongoing pandemic, right? We have seen in countries around the world that has posed specific challenges for women, of course, in the home, but also in the public sphere. And I was curious if you could reflect a little bit on the experiences of women politicians and party members in Malaysia over the course of the past year and how that fits into the broader context of, the challenges that women face in the political sphere in your country.
Thank you very much. A very good evening to everyone. Yes, it's evening. It's 10 p.m. Malaysia time. And I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to share my views in this program, which I think it's a very important program. With regards to the pandemic, we find that in Malaysia, and I think globally as well, women are more at risk compared to men, because more women lose jobs compared to men. And when we work from home, is the women who suffer or have more difficulties, because in Malaysia we have many children, we have big families, and sometimes the homes are very crowded. There's very crowded space, and having to cope with the children having schooling online, having lessons online. I find that we have real difficulties because we have difficulties with internet penetration. We have difficulties with gadgets, because sometimes a family may have 2 or 3 children having to attend class, and the mother may be working from home, and at the same time she has to supervise the children with their online classes. We also find that domestic violence increase in numbers, and unfortunately, what happened in Malaysia was that the pandemic, we started the movement control order or the lockdown just weeks after a change in government. There was a change in government, and there was a total change, and suddenly there was a lockdown. And I think the new government were not prepared to manage the situation. The ministers that were in place appointed had to handle it immediately after they were appointed, and we had real difficulties managing all the parliamentarian, not only women parliamentarian, all the parliamentarian had difficulties managing the pandemic. And initially we had difficulties with food supplies because everything was closed, and then people lose jobs, and then we have families calling in asking for assistance because they have run out of food, and they need help. And then the government was not forthcoming with assistance. That was the situation 1 year ago, and we have improved now. However, it was the past 1 year have been very, very difficult, and I think women are the ones who had suffered most, and especially I was talking about domestic violence. Women are also affected with mental health issues because losing jobs and losing income. And as I said, working from home. We also have situations where people become poor overnight, just poor. Suddenly they lose jobs and they lose everything, and rate of commit suicide increased. So that was the situation we had to deal with, and I'm glad to say that 1 year have passed and we are in a better situation now. We are able to better manage the situation.
Are there specific initiatives that you would like to see happen within your own political party to support women politicians and party members who are navigating some of the challenges you were speaking about?
Actually, even though in Malaysia we are in a society which is very much patriarchal in nature, I must say that my party have come a long way, because we will be celebrating our 23rd anniversary and in April, and we are one of the biggest party in Malaysia. We have more than 1 million members, and half of that are women. And since day one, the first day that the party was formed and I was involved in the women's wing, we have worked hard at ensuring that we sensitize the men. We provide enabling environment within the party. We also develop and train the women, the young women. We also have policies. Also in our constitution, we have specific mention about women, involving women in the mainstream of the party, because we have the women's wing, but at the same time we have the youth wing that also incorporate young women. And in the women's wing, we also have a caucus, a caucus of young women, where we mentor the young women to prepare them to take a more challenge in the mainstream. And then when the women feel more confident enough, we push them into the mainstream of the party. And we have now our women. It is by design. It is by design that we do this, and we push women, and we train the men. In fact, we get the men to bring in to propose policies with regards to women, to ensure that the men are the ones who support women candidacy, and so on and so forth. And I must say that we do have a quota in the party, but we do know that it is not everything. We are pushing for more gender parity eventually, but yeah, we have a difference. It is a bit different in our party, and I must say that compared to what we have in our country, our party is more forward. I give an example. We know that period poverty is a real issue globally. So recently, the women in my party were handing out sanitary towels to address the issue of period poverty. And in fact, during the floods, we suffered quite bad floods in December. In the relief centers, those were also the requirements, the demands that they were asking for. They were asking for sanitary towels. So our women were distributing the sanitary towels, and then there was a group of men that ridiculed them. And it came out in the social media. But what happened was, the men in our party, the young men in our party, came forward and defended our women. So I think we have achieved something when the young men, and it was really viral on social media, and it was the men who defended us, the women. And then they say, don't your mother teach you anything? Are you not ashamed?
Thank you for sharing that. And I think, it's a great example of how it's, the engagement of men is crucial to try and remove some of the obstacles that women face, rather than only focusing on capacity building of women, who are often just as qualified. I'd like to take the remaining time to speak with our final panelist, last but not least, Mr. Hector Larios. Now, Mexico has come a huge way over the past decades in terms of gender equality in politics, and they've obviously been very successful measures that have been strengthened over time. I'd be curious to hear a bit more about your specific party, and specifically, is there a single reform or measure that your party has implemented that has made a big difference to gender equality in the party?
Muy buenos días.
Good morning to everybody. From the northern part of Mexico, it's 7 a.m. in the morning. So it's good morning. Thank you so much, Konrad Adenauer, for this debate. This is such a crucial subject. First of all, I'd like to say that the PAN is a party, it's an 80-year-old party. The most important thing from the get-go, from the first day, is that we've always had more women than men as members. It's a party that, based on its history, has had more female members than men. However, only one woman has been president of the party in a very short time. Therefore, we still have a long way to go. I always must say that in the history of the PAN, 2/3 of us live in an anti-democratic party, an ambience, an authoritarian. So even though we did win the elections, they don't acknowledge our conquest. And women really play an important role because they really made a bigger impact compared to men in transforming the society. And in fact, we have made great strides. Recently, PAN proposed some initiatives recently, 2 years ago, so that all the state bodies have gender equity, meaning half number of women and half number of men. So we have undertaken this path to make progress. But since 2014, we presented an initiative so that in our parliaments, the candidates had to be half men and half women. I can say now that in the Senate, there is half men and half women as far as numbers. In the Congress, the House of Congress, in the Congress, same thing. In local legislations, we have 50-50. So half are men and half women. However, in the positions of higher positions levels, we still have a long way to go. We have not had any woman who has been a president. We only have one female president in our party, but for a very short term. So we have, for instance, the current legislature, every year you elect a new speaker. During these 3 years, 2 years, for 2 years we have had women as speakers. So yes, we're making progress by leaps and bounds. We're making progress. So our biggest challenge is for the greater responsibility positions. So I believe that we need to train more women. I'm gonna give you 3 cases. We have several female mayors in our country. In big cities and the capitals of states, we have 3 female mayors that were re-elected. That was never the case before. In the case of Reynosa, which is a town on the northern border, which is very conflictive because they are invaded by drug traffickers, Mayor Maki was re-elected by 57% of the votes, even though there were many parties and many male and female candidates. In the case of the capital of Chihuahua, yesterday, our female mayor probably will be the governor of Chihuahua. She was re-elected 2 years ago with a 54% of votes. And the female mayor in a state in the middle of the country, the state of Guadalajara, probably she will also run for governor, was re-elected by 52%, meaning in re-election, the highest percentage of votes, we had it with women and not with men. And we're talking about young women, especially 2 of them, the one from Aguas Calientes and Marcampos in Chihuahua. We're talking about young women. Therefore, on this way forward, we're not far, so that for the next presidency re-elections, we may have women. We have several challenges. What are we doing? Yes, we are changes. Within the PAN, we also have quotas. We only can have parity, and in the positions of responsibility, we don't have these rotation rules, but I'm pretty sure that the next president of the PAN will be a woman. But even though it's a party that in its whole history has had more women than men, women were reluctant, based on their own interests, to take on positions of responsibility. But right now, women are fighting. How to incentivize that? Well, all modern parties have an internal democratic struggle in order to create a governing coalition that leads the party. And since there are quotas, and unfortunately, I mean, half of them have to be women, half of them have to be men. All those groups that fight in order to create this coalition, they know that it's indispensable women participation, not just based on quota, but by their own leadership. And that's what we're working on it.
Maybe come in here to, these are really interesting points. I want to make sure we have enough time to open it up to the discussion. So apologies for the interruption, but I wanted to sort of single out something you said. First of all, that, voters are voting for women. So I think there's often this argument, right, that there is discrimination on the side of voters. And you just mentioned several examples of female mayors getting reelected. I think it's a very powerful example in the way that parties can really benefit electorally as well from having women in leadership position. Maybe this is something we can pick up again in the discussion. There are a few questions that were already posted by participants, so I'll just go through some of them, but also invite anyone else who has a question to post it in the chat at this point so we can pose it directly to the panelists. And actually, one of the first questions goes directly to perhaps the Latin American context or Central American context. And we had a question about the abuse of quota mechanisms. So how in some countries, one of the problems with using a quota is that male politicians end up using it to, for example, nominate female relatives instead of perhaps the most qualified female politician or activist. And perhaps I just go back to you, Mr. Rios, if you'd like to take that question and talk about whether that is a problem you have been dealing with and what you think some of the solutions to that are.
Bien, sí es un
Yes,
problema.
that is a problem indeed. In any sphere, if there is a rule, it may be violated or ill used. The parity rule sometimes are not used correctly. And it is true, not within the PAN, but in a different party, the Green Party, where they appointed women, and once they were elected, then they quit. And so it was a man who substituted her. So there were rules that changed in my country, meaning two people that have to be from the same gender, 2 men or 2 women. So if somebody quits, then same gender candidate will take over. And we have a mixed system, and they are elected directly. They are elected directly by majority men and women, and half of them have to be men and women, which is 40%. And half of them have to be men or women. In the proportionate representation, there is more abuse. Those that have the control of the party in whatever country it is sometimes can propose women that do not have a future in politics, relatives or friends that will not advocate for women. We want for women and in the future may represent a great potential in order to be candidates for higher responsibility position.
Thank you. It's slightly different topic, perhaps going back to what Ms. Abdullah was talking about earlier. We had a question about sort of the exclusion from women in democratic transitions that you talked about. You talked about how women are, often at the forefront of democratic movements and democratic mobilization, but then that doesn't necessarily translate into political power afterwards. Could you talk a bit about how women reacted to that exclusion and what have been the responses on the side of female activists?
That's a very tough one to gauge, actually. I think the problem is that up until very recently, we haven't even urged the women as much as we should to come to positions of leadership. And without that urging, I think one of the questions that you posited in the paper that you gave us was that is this all of this seen as an elitist sort of work? Is this like an elite work to get women, like gender, all this? Is this like an elite preoccupation? There's a sense of that here too, not perhaps elite, but it's a very small group of women. It's a very small group of very liberal, very educated women saying this. So there's a tendency to try and dismiss that as such too. from the women, see, we had the trainings, we have the women wings, we have everything that should be there, just short of actually saying that we have to fill certain amounts of seats with women. So until we say that that hasn't been done, and I'm not sure if the answer is yes and no. Not too much, because we hadn't pushed them enough we hadn't pushed the women's wing and the activists to demand enough either. So that's a shortcoming of the part, that the demanding wasn't there is a shortcoming in itself, I think. A shortcoming by the leadership of the party.
Yeah, that makes sense. Ms. Breyer, turning back to you, one of the questions we received, I believe from someone in Chile, actually, but I thought you might nevertheless be able to speak to it, was about struggles that go beyond just gender within political parties, and that are also about generational change, right? So you have, on the one hand, the challenge to make more space for women to enter political parties, but then on the other hand, you also have the challenge to make more space for a younger generation to come into positions of power, when there's often sort of an older guard that, you know, has been there for a long time, is maybe reluctant to make space. Could you talk a little bit about how that plays out in your experience, and what are some of the avenues for younger people to forge a path in political parties?
Vielen Dank. Ich glaube, es ist wichtig, dass man...
Yes, thank you very much. I think it's very important that young men and women become involved, so that the party field has to be more diverse and work more in the parliaments. Our age average is rather big, and in our party, we are having an additional quota for young people. So we are really trying to get them involved, not just in the youth organizations that our parties usually have, and beyond young people. Beyond young people. I have the English channel. I don't know why you're not hearing me. Okay, great. Where we don't have quotas and party positions are always always have the same people on them, that's a reason why we're forced to encourage other people and to have a more diverse population. When the population changes, when the electors, women and men, change, parties have to change. Other than that, they don't represent the population, and the acceptance and the differentiation between parties and young and old electors becomes too big, and then you don't look at yourself anymore as one society. So then we have that the discussion where they're saying, oh, the politics, oh, the politicians. In my opinion, that's not the right attitude.
Also about who views themselves represented in political parties. Ms. Saleh, could you also speak to this question? I don't know if you've encountered these struggles over generational change, and particularly in how to make more space for younger women within your own political party.
So far, no, because there's a lot of space which has not been filled up yet. Well, we are a relatively young party. We are making, our problem is the opposite, is getting more people, getting more young women to come forward, and ensuring that they are ready to take the responsibility, because it's very challenging. And I mean, I always feel this, that a woman have got to be extra good to be even considered as good. So, and then and also within themselves, their self-confidence. They must feel that they are able to manage it. They must have families that are supportive, because being in a society that is very Asian, where women always believe or brought up to believe that they should only play a supportive role. So it's that challenge that they have to overcome. No, we don't. As a conclusion, we don't face that.
And we have another question that you might be able to speak to from Olachi Opara, who's from Nigeria, and is asking, you know, in many countries around the world, one of the problems is that politics is viewed as a dirty game. There's, you know, the impression that it's violent, that it's full of insults, and that discourages women in particular from engaging in politics because they know they will receive gendered abuse. How can this be changed?
I believe that both women and men have to work together against this, because it is not just a woman issue. It's not just women who have to stand up and speak against that. The men have to stand up with us, together with us. And the women especially must be united and gather in as many men as we can on our side. For example, we women parliamentarians in Malaysia do also suffer from sexist remarks in the chambers, in parliament, in the chambers. But recently, during the International Women's Day, I took the initiative, and I'm a member from the opposition side. I took the initiative to come up to draft a statement on calling for a gender-sensitive parliament. And we managed to get all women parliamentarians to put their name down, all of us, you know, whichever party, whichever side of the bench we are from, then all of us put our names down, which I think is an achievement. And then the second step is to have a call for all the men to put their name down, a call towards a gender-sensitive parliament as defined by the IPU, and we're going to send all the names to IPU. So now we're getting all the men to put their names down. So we'll see who don't commit, who don't put their pledge to call for Malaysian parliament to be a gender-sensitive parliament. So it's not just where women need to stand up, we need to stand up together, and we need to bring in as many men with us.
Ms. Breyer, is this an issue that has come up in the CDU as well, this issue of, you know, sexist harassment, gendered harassment in politics, and what a party can do against that?
I think to address it in terms of there are a few areas that we can address the issue. Number one, we need to have a culture. We need to develop a culture within the party itself. And we need to have an understanding, an unwritten rule within the party. We need to have champions on this issue. And of course, if we can also talk about it, have some sort of written policies about it. And so far, I find that our leaders, all of our leaders are very sensitive to that, and they're very, very supportive. So to the extent that if any leader come up with a sexist statement within the party, he will be in the minority and everybody will be against him.
Right. So it's like
developing that kind of culture.
A code of conduct, and then also enforcement of that code of conduct.
Yes.
Ms. Breyer, would you like to come in on that as well?
Ja.
Yes.
So geht, genau. Wir haben bei uns in der Partei auch im
In
Rahmen
our party, we also have rules, and we have an ombudswoman, so to speak, ombudsperson. If there are cases of sexual harassment, so that there's somebody that they can actually turn to outside of the actual board or leadership, so that somebody feels discriminated against, that person can address the ombudsperson. And it doesn't have to necessarily be the president, because it could be the same person. So we're doing that within our party. The discussion in the German parliament, in the Bundestag, and in the German press is very current, because a number of female parliamentarians have reported in a big article about sexual harassment within the parliament by members of parliament. And I believe it's correct that this is being done in the public, that it's being done through the press, and that it's made clear what is possible, what is not possible. This culture and these occurrences have increased with the entry of the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland, the party on the right. And we can say that other colleagues have similar experiences. And I think it's correct that you become loud, that you say, I want to make this known, and that we all together will fight against this, and also that the men take part in this.
I think those are some really helpful pointers on how to kind of address this problem, which is seemingly pervasive in all societies. Mr. Lajos, turning back to you, one question we received from South Africa was that, you know, in South Africa, there are high levels of women's representation across different levels of government, similarly to how it is in Mexico now, but this representation has not always translated into tangible social change for ordinary women, ordinary people. So the question was, how can we turn the representation into actual opportunity and inclusion for everyone in society? And I'm curious how you think about that in the Mexican context.
Well,
yes, there are many things we can do. We need to work together, and this is an issue certainly that is extremely serious. It's not generalized, but it does happen, and it is certainly a cause for concern there within politics. The second thing that we believe is very important to address is the salary gap. As in many countries of the world, the income of women, of working women, are proportionally lower than that of men, about 17% less, and we have to fight that salary gap. And even worse is the issue of lack of adjustment or the challenges in the workplace. It's not the same effort for a man than a woman to find a job or to get promoted in certain areas. Those are the greatest challenges that we need to address through legislation and practices to change the behavior of society to respect women, so that there is no violence, gender-based violence, which is unacceptable. This should be highly criminalized, and I think we must remove the low burden of proof from women and place it on the perpetrators. And what we have found along the way is for the inclusion of women, when they want to have access, we need to give them access. And we secondly need to remove the salary gap. These are the challenges, and this is what we are working on.
I think we have maybe time for one more question before turning back over to Ms. Ostheimer. So I just would take the privilege to ask the last question maybe to Ms. Abdullah, and to reflect a little bit on what you think is the next step. You know, you talked about a whole range of challenges that are making it still very difficult for women to gain access to leadership positions in the Maldives. What's the next step for you? What do you think is needed, and what kind of support would be useful?
I think the next step is, like I said, we've brought about legislation for local councils. So that's at the very island level, at the very community level. I think what we now need to is implement this across all political parties and across all national elections. So for basically quota system for the parliament. I think, but also while doing that, also I think it's time to have a quota system for political party leaderships, because it's always men getting elected to leadership positions in political parties itself. We have, in the Multiple Democratic Party, we have what are called branches. And these branches are, the leaders of these branches are who make it to the National Congress, who then implement party policy and elect party leaderships. So we need a quota system of, we need a system where a certain amount of these individual branches, the women, certain quota has to be women. So I think within the parties and then for the parliament, there'd be huge, I understand there'd be huge backlash on this. Some of it even from women. There's a lot of, if you made it, why can't other women? There's a lot of that going on as well. I think everybody in this panel understand the answer to that, that just because one woman or a few women make it doesn't mean that all women will have equal access or will have equitable access. We understand that, but there's a lot of that question also. And there's a lot of backlash on, if you're talking about women's rights, why are we not discussing men's rights? I mean, unbelievably, that comes up too. So I understand there's a lot of backlash on that. But I was very interested to hear Sylvia's code of conduct. I'd be very, would it be possible, Saskia, for me to get a copy of that? I'd very much be keen to implement that within my party and my parliament. And while I have this leadership position in the parliament, I think this is the time when I'll have the most influence. So I should put it to good use.
Yeah. And I'm sure we can facilitate that connection through the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, which is one of the reasons these conversations are useful, is to learn what others are doing. I think this is maybe a good point to wrap up. And I just want to take the opportunity to thank you all for sharing your perspectives, for touching on such a wide range of issues, from the need for further stronger quotas, but also for much more far-reaching measures to tackle issues of harassment and violence, and measures to actually transform opportunities for everyday citizens and societies. I think we've sort of run through a lot of topics, but I think it's giving us a good idea of the landscape and also some of the points of similarity between very different political contexts. So thank you all for joining us, and thank you for all the participation from the audience too. And I'll turn over to Andrea Ostheimer at this point.
Thank you very much, and certainly with much pleasure we will facilitate this kind of exchange of experiences. I think it's the best outcome you can have of such a gathering, that you really can install some kind of level of cooperation. It was an extremely rich discussion today, and I would like to thank all our panelists for sharing your early mornings, your late evenings with us to engage on that topic. And I think it's always rewarding to bring really together different country, regional and cultural perspectives. But nevertheless, I think also the discussion has highlighted, despite the diversities, we see that women have to demand much more and more proactively leadership positions, but also men have to open up and they have to encourage women to become more active. Women have to stand united, and when I heard about that, I was thinking about my own work experience in Africa, where one criticism quite often came from the group of women politicians. We are not solidarity, we don't show enough solidarity amongst ourselves. We have to support and really back up and stand united. But also as women, we need the support of men, particularly men in leadership positions and higher up in the party hierarchy, because only there we can also instigate reform processes. Because in the end, parties have to change, Honorable Priya said, they have to change and they have to reflect the diversity of society. So once again, thank you to all our panelists and our excellent moderator. Saskia, that was really really stunning, especially as I was not sure about your Spanish proficiency, but you managed very well to convert and to translate all Spanish questions coming in. And last but not least, a big thank you to our audiences who have tuned in also from Latin America, from Europe, from the US. Thank you very much for also being a faithful follower of CAS New York. And at that time, I would also like to invite you to join us tomorrow for our next CSW event, 10 o'clock, same time. And we will start a discussion about female diplomacy and the role of women in foreign and policy and security and defense policy. So if you have the time, 10 o'clock New York time, we are happy to see you again. Thank you so much and enjoy the rest of your day and your evening. Thank you.